Hi, everyone. Welcome to WQRF's final summer school session of 2025. My name is Lilia, and I'm the project coordinator here at WQRF. I want to give a special thanks to Calgon Carbon Corporation for sponsoring the entire summer school series. We are grateful for their support in making this education free for all stakeholders in water. I will email you a recording of today's webinar, but you can also visit our website at wqrf.org/webinars to see all the recordings. Daniel McGurvey is our presenter today. Daniel will highlight the fundamentals of activated carbon, teach you how to choose the right carbon for PFAS treatment, and discuss Calgon Carbon's GAC reactivation process. Daniel joined Calgon Carbon in 2022 as an applications engineer in the Drinking Water Solutions business unit. Before starting at Calgon Carbon, he received a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Penn State University. Since joining, Daniel has focused on GAC and PAC drinking water applications. So with that, I will turn it over to Daniel to begin his presentation.
All right, thank you for the introduction. So yes, I'm going to be talking about first granular activated carbon and then how it's utilized with respect to PFAS specifically. And so sort of where I'll get started here is just start with the fundamentals, the basics of activated carbon. From very first question, what is granular activated carbon? So granular activated carbon is a filter media that is manufactured from carbon-rich raw materials. Technically, any sort of carbonaceous material can theoretically be used as an activated carbon, but there are, some that are a little bit more common, a little bit more used, just work a little bit better in general. So some common ones are like coals, different grades of coal, like bituminous and subbituminous and lignite, as well as coconut and wood are two other types that are commonly used as either granular or sometimes powder activated carbon. How granular activated carbon actually removes contaminants is through electrostatic forces that cause contaminants to adsorb to the surface of the media. So kind of looking at this figure in the middle, you already know a sponge has absorption. It absorbs and uptakes water. Adsorption is more like tape sticking and adhering to the carbon. So that's sort of what's happening in the pores of the granular activated carbon itself, is the contaminants are sticking to it rather than absorbing like a sponge would. It is also a best available technology for various organics per the EPA. This, of course, including PFAS. So it is one that is, approved, well studied, well known for a lot of different contaminants, and it'll remove all those different contaminants. It's also a semi-renewable resource, meaning in a lot of cases it can be reactivated and reused. And so this is really important, and what makes it unique compared to maybe some other technologies is being able to reactivate that carbon, destroy the contaminants off of it, and then reuse it to its full capacity. So you don't have a continuous, you have a cycle of being able to reuse that carbon. And then the last note is the removal is governed by the kinetics of diffusion. So it takes a little bit of a process for the contaminants to actually get into and then stick to the pores of a carbon. And so because of that, there are different parameters that I'll talk about a little bit later that have to be considered and designed around to make sure that there is enough time for contaminants to get through the film and the pores and onto the surface of the carbon itself. So as I mentioned, the US EPA lists GAC as a best available technology for multiple contaminants found in drinking water. And what's really nice about granular activated carbon is it's not selective. It can provide simultaneous contaminant removal. It might not be as often of an issue in some of the point of entry, point of view space, but if there are certain contaminants that are maybe being removed with carbon already, and now you have introduced to a PFAS problem, that carbon is probably already removing the PFAS to an extent. It just might be a different type of carbon, could be best for that PFAS compared to maybe a different contaminant. But it will remove all types of these contaminants, including PFAS, including removing TOC to remove disinfecting byproducts, different pesticides and VOCs. And so, there are lots of things. Chlorine and chloramine are another commonly utilized one. And so all of these are important uses of carbon. but it will remove all of these at once. It's not just selective to one of these. So that's an advantage if you're looking at, multiple of these types of contaminants that you're hoping to remove with the carbon. So a little slide and a little fact that's always really cool to look at is how much space is actually inside a handful of carbon. So one handful has the surface area of an entire football field, or around 4,500 meters squared. So the carbon's extremely porous. That's all those pores that make up that surface area. And because of all those pores after the activation, it has a ton of surface area, which makes it so effective and gives it a ton of room to remove these certain contaminants. There's also some differences in structures of activated carbon, either between carbon types or even between potential sizes of carbons. So there's really a million-fold range in pore sizes in an activated carbon granule. This can be from even visible cracks and crevices down to the actual molecular scale pores, where we think about macropores, mesopores, and micropores. And really only the smallest five-fold range of pores are actually absorbing and removing those contaminants from the water. And inside an individual granule, there are really two main types of those smallest pores, and that's transport pores and adsorption pores. And these are really sort of mutually exclusive pores where the transport pores you can think of as highways. They only transport compounds into the adsorption pores, and then you can think of the adsorption pores as sort of parking lots. That's where these contaminants actually sit and again get stuck to that carbon. So you can kind of think of this as sort of a design of a city, and I'll sort of talk about some of the differences in pore structure and the importance of that between different carbon types. So not all activated carbon is the same. There are a few different things that can make granular activated carbon different, or activated carbon in general different. The first is forms of activated carbon. So it can come in a few different forms. There's starting or base material. So as I mentioned, coal, coconut, wood, peat, things like that all sort of have their differences. There's also differences in how the GAC is actually made and manufactured. So there are definitely some different manufacturing abilities that are stronger than some others. And there are also some other properties like the size of the pores itself. But in general, just like anything medication cars, picking the right GAC is really critical, especially with something like PFAS, which can be a lot more difficult to remove to these part per trillion levels that a lot of times these are down to and being tested at and regulated to. So we'll start with different forms of activated carbon. The main focus today is going to be on granular, but I do like to note there are a couple different forms as well, like extruded and powder. Extruded carbon is usually used with more in air and gas removal compared to water. Granular is more typical in removing things from water, and then powder is also a lot of times used in water and drinking water, but it's not the exact same process as a granular carbon. Typically, that's usually injected in like an early stage of a treatment plant. So it's an interesting form of carbon that's useful, but less going to be the focus today. We're mainly going to be focused on the granular carbon and where it sits in its typical vessels or filters. So again, there are some differences in raw materials for activated carbon that can have differences in how they actually impact performance. So there's things like wood and coconut, peat or lignite, and then bituminous coal. And so all of these sort of have their differences in that pore structure. Again, I mentioned those transport pores or highways and adsorption pores or parking lots. The starting material can really dictate the performance based on that. So, for example, a wood carbon typically has a lot of the highways, a lot of the transport pores, but doesn't actually have a lot of the parking lots to sit. So if this was a design of a city, you'd actually be able to get around pretty well, but you wouldn't actually be able to park anywhere in the city. And so that sort of happens with trying to remove some of these contaminants with a wood carbon. The coconut carbon is really the opposite problem. There's actually a lot of parking lots. There's a lot of parking space in adsorption sites, but there's not a lot of transport pores or highways. So you can think of this as like a traffic jam happening in a city where contaminants are basically getting stuck, not being able to actually get to the parking lots or get to the adsorption sites, even though there is plenty of room once they get there. And that can be an issue when trying to remove some of these contaminants like PFAS. And a bituminous coal, I like to think of a well-designed city or a happy middle ground there where it has a lot of those parking lots or absorption sites, but it also has enough of the transport pores or highways to get around. You can both get around the city and there's enough room to park when you get there. And so because of that, it ends up having a lot more capacity, as I'll sort of talk about later, compared to a lot of these other starting materials like a wood or a coconut. There can also be other impacts of raw materials where these can dictate the product possibilities. So there can be a lot of differences in ash impurities from a bituminous to a coconut, higher apparent density, which typically just means generally better performance when these are higher, differences in abrasion, and then as I mentioned, some of those capacity and kinetics are really different between starting materials. So it's really important to make sure you have the right starting material to get the longest runtime. I mean, that's especially true with these PFAS applications, because it's really only bituminous coal that's going to get you significant periods of runtime in removing the PFAS. There are also some differences in how the material is activated, or really differences before activation. So there's a typical direct activation where a single coal will go through the typical crushing, baking, activation, and screening process. Potential post-processing included as needed. Things like acid washing or things along those lines are included in there as well before the finished product. But reagglomeration is a little bit different. This actually takes a coal blend. So direct activation is usually a single source of coal. This takes a coal blend from a single source, pulverizes, and essentially puts them back together to give a lot more consistent product quality before going through the rest of that activation process. So if there are differences in the starting material in terms of impurities, ash, things along those lines, you won't see those as much when going through the reagglomeration process. And there are some other really good benefits of reagglomeration as well. So we do see better transport structure overall, giving better kinetics and performance, better hardness. There's less dust or fines generated in the reagglomerated products. Well, direct activated products have an inferior transport structure where we don't see as good of kinetics and performance, worse hardness, and a lot of times there's more dust generated from using that same raw material type. We also get uniform activation, and that's where some of the consistency comes from, is we have a really good tailored pore size distribution, which gives that more consistent and better performance overall. While with a direct activated product, sometimes you can have uneven activation in the granule and get highly variable performance, even if some of the specifications are similar with a direct activated product. Sometimes you might end up with a lot worse performance than you saw before, because it's just that one sort of coal type that's not being kind of combined with sort of others and put back together in a more consistent manner. And then, as I mentioned, that highly consistent product quality is really the most important and the main benefit, or one of the main benefits of using a reagglomerated bituminous coal, is just having that guaranteed consistent product quality, because we're taking those different sources and kind of attaching them together and using them together. So there are also a couple main system design parameters. As I mentioned, the diffusion can be a limiting factor. For carbon, this isn't an immediate process. It's not instantaneous that contaminants are being removed. And so there are a couple common parameters that we see to best utilize and make sure the carbon's working as effectively as possible. The first one is the empty bed contact time, or EBCT. And this is the time required to cycle a volume of water equal to the volume occupied by the media in the vessel. And this is not exactly the hydraulic residence time. This is more of a simply calculated value in this equation below. So really, you can just think of the contact time as the volume of media in the filter. Usually we look at this in gallons divided by the flow rate through the filter, which is usually seen in GPM, gives you a time or contact time in minutes. So that's sort of the definition of that contact time. And you need sufficient contact time to make sure you're getting your desired treatment objectives. And in some cases, if it's possible, we recommend using lead lag systems, especially for things like PFAS, although there can be other options, or depending on the treatment goal and things, where that maybe not be required, but a lot of times that is recommended. And then some issues of having an undersized contact time is just overall reduced service life. So if you have lower contact times, you're just not really getting the water in contact enough to diffuse through the carbon completely. You'll see some premature breakthrough and diminished media utilization. Basically, more frequently, you're going to be changing out your carbon, which just adds to operating costs overall if these are not designed to the right contact time. And for PFAS, that's typically around 10 minutes is what we would recommend. Some other contaminants have a little bit more of a range, but around 10 minutes per vessel is typical for a contact time for PFAS. Again, because they're down to those extremely low levels, that just makes sure there's really enough time for these contaminants to absorb. There's also the hydraulic loading rate, or HLR. This is the volumetric flow velocity, expressed typically as flow per area. You'll usually see this as GPM per square foot. And this is just the flow rate of the filter in gallons per minute divided by the surface area of the filter in feet squared. And the reason this is important is it controls what we call the mass transfer zone. So looking at this figure on the right, the water enters the inlet at the top portion of the carbon bed. And then only a certain top portion of the bed is actually removing contaminants at first. And then as that top layer gets spent, the carbon below it starts being used. And so you kind of have a mass transfer zone that moves down through the bed as carbon on top is slowly being used. And so having the right hydraulic loading rate allows that mass transfer zone to not be too high or too low. It allows for even absorption and carbon use overall. The recommended range for really any carbon system is 2 to 10 GPM per square foot. So you can have a bit of a range for this sort of parameter, but too low below that, you can have issues with flow channeling. Either too low or too high, you can end up having poor media utilization, either because of the flow channeling or because you're pushing the carbon through the bed a little bit too fast. Even at the right contact time, if you're pushing that a little too fast, you can end up not actually getting the same treatment you would maybe expect from a lower hydraulic loading rate. And then, of course, the main really issue with too high is you can end up with excessive head loss that can result in mechanical failures in equipment or a vessel. So that's also another reason that it's important to sort of keep these in the right range. So I sort of already discussed really the importance of choosing the right carbon and what those right carbons are. You really want a reagglomerated bituminous carbon, kind of gives you the best performance, but I do want to show some of the differences here and really look at some specific results and performance results for PFAS between these different carbon types to really, make sure, this isn't based off of nothing. We have some data really showing the importance of using the right carbon, especially for PFAS, but really for any application. And of course, the application itself matters. So for point of entry applications, these are typically utilizing a more typical granular carbon. That's a 12 by 40 or 8 by 30. For PFAS removal, we really see the best use with the 12 by 40 mesh. But the 8 by 30 is used for some other contaminants. So some of you may already be using some of this size for other applications. But we would typically recommend the 12 by 40 for the best runtime in a point of entry application. This is typically using multiple cubic feet of carbon, where contact times are minutes long, again, usually around 10 minutes for these sort of more vessel applications, filter applications. The filters can be back washable. Usually we recommend trying to have a back washable filter in these types of systems, because there will be carbon fines sort of mixed in with the carbon that are important to get out and make sure you get out, so they aren't really coming out of the system or anything. So that's something, there are options if it's not, but we generally recommend trying to have a back washable filter, especially when putting new carbon in. And often these are used as part of a treatment train. So maybe they're not the only process going on, or maybe there's multiple containers of carbon all being utilized in a series or parallel sort of formation to make sure you're getting all the water you need through the carbon with the sort of right contact times and hydraulic loading rates. So these sort of applications are more similar to somewhat of a large scale filter you might see at a big water plant, just scaled down, but they're still using beds of carbon, larger beds of carbon with, cubic feet of carbon and having that typical 10 minutes of contact time. For point of use applications, these are a lot of times utilizing more fine mesh carbons with usually less than a kilogram of carbon. And contact times a lot of times really only last a few seconds. So these are a little bit more specified and designed specifically for these point of use applications so that you can have that contact time a few seconds to give you the same removal with the fine mesh as you would see with the larger mesh in a point of entry application. These filters aren't typically backwashable because of that finer mesh, and they can be used as a singular filter or part of a treatment train. A lot of times they are more singular filters, but there are some examples of ones in treatment trains. So yeah, I show now some actual performance data with these applications. So this is NSF 53 total PFAS performance testing. So this is more typical of what the point of use applications might look like, where we have these NSF 53 tests that are, again, seconds of contact time. And you can see our starting inlet concentrations, especially with contaminants like PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS, PFBS, have very high inlet concentrations in this. These are sort of the main ones that are regulated and a lot of times being removed. And then we first look at the standard test, which is the maximum individual outlet concentration, which is 20 parts per trillion for a lot of these, except for PFNA, which is 6. And there's no specific individual concentration for PFDA or PFBS. To also note, this was used with a total organic carbon concentration of 1 ppm. Sometimes TOC can be a contaminant that has some interference with PFAS performance, although at a level like this, that's really not too much of an issue. We're not going to see too much of a difference in this case. And so really what we're going to be looking at is the breakthrough to those different levels. Again, 20 parts per trillion for a lot of them, except for PFNA. And in this, we looked at coconut carbon, a reagglomerated bituminous coal, and then a really specifically made next gen POU reagglomerated bituminous coal. And so this next gen coal is really more specifically designed for even better use in point of use applications. So it's designed a little bit differently than the typical reagglomerated coal to really optimize that PFAS performance in an even better way. And then the y-axis here is just looking at the bed volumes to breakthrough of these respective levels. So you can first see the coconut really breaks through almost immediately in all instances. The best it's doing is a little over 2,000 bed volumes treated, but any of the reagglomerated coals are much higher and much longer run times, and that's again a lot of times due to those differences in pore structures in the coal compared to the coconut. They have a little bit more optimized structure. And then that next gen POU reagglomerated coal even has 2 times the total PFAS removal compared to even just the regular reagglomerated coal. And so we do see even better performance with this really optimized carbon specifically used for PFAS. And then we also looked at with this test breakthrough at 4 parts per trillion. And the reason is that's where a lot of the regulations are, especially for PFOA and PFOS. And this is also just above the really detection limits, which are at 2 parts per trillion for a lot of these PFAS compounds. So this is really shortly after you're detecting PFAS and the effluent is sort of where these bed volumes to breakthrough are. And again, the coconut, they're in yellow. You don't really see much of the yellow because it doesn't perform that well compared to the reagglomerated coals or the next gen POU reagglomerated coal. So really just pretty immediate breakthrough with the coconut. And then again, about 2 times of the performance with the next gen POU coal with total PFAS and sometimes better or around the same performance as the total PFAS with the specific compounds. But in all cases, again, that optimized next gen POU coal is performing even better than just the bituminous reagglomerated coal itself. So also looking at GAC for PFAS removal, this would be a little bit more typical of a design for a point of entry application. This was from a pilot test in Delaware with pretty high influent concentrations. You can see the design, we're around 3.7 GPM per square foot. And in this pilot, we have around 5.6 minutes of contact time. But as long as we're using that same hydraulic loading rate, getting a consistent mass transfer zone, we can scale that to the 10 minutes that would really want to be utilized at full scale to scale those results and look at sort of make sure that these results can kind of be used well. So what we see, the breakthrough we see in these results are essentially about half of what you would see with a full scale system at these PFAS concentrations. This is with a FilterZorb 400 media, which is a 12 by 40 mesh reagglomerated bituminous coal. And again, pretty high influent concentrations, especially of PFOA, PFHXS, PFOS. These may not be as typical that you'll see, but this really goes to show how proven and how well the carbon can remove these types of PFAS, where even initial breakthrough of any is 20,000 bed volumes, and that's at that 5 minutes of contact time. So really double that, we'd expect to see some initial breakthrough at a more typical 10-minute contact time system with low TOC. So FilterZorb is really a proven method for removing the regulated PFAS from the water to below detection limits for pretty significant periods of time. And if you have lower concentrations, those times are going to be, those run times are going to be even longer than you might see in this pilot study. I also want to touch on GAC reactivation. As I mentioned, activated carbon can be reactivated and reused. It's really a sustainable and proven solution to PFAS and sort of trying to end the PFAS cycle in general. So first, reactivation, it's a unique disposal and reuse method for GAC only. So there are other types of medias out there that are like an ion exchange resin that can't be reactivated. They have to be either put into an incinerator or just put into a landfill, which can come with its own sort of issues, but carbon can be reactivated and reused into other applications as well. And so that's really a big advantage, is being able to reactivate that carbon. So looking at thermal reactivation, overall disposal options. So with reactivation, you get a certified reactivation of spent media. You don't have landfill liabilities. If you were to put it in a landfill, there's some worry of some type of liability coming up in the future. And it's a lower cost than an incineration or a landfill, as well as just more sustainable than other disposal options because it's being used typically in these cases, it being reactivated and then reused into some types of industrial applications. It's also referenced in the EPA disposal guideline document. So the EPA is aware of this and is really looking into this as an approved method to destroy the PFAS and be a sustainable option overall. And even the Department of Defense names it as a preferred method for disposal of activated carbon. So overall, this is just a more sustainable solution for the drinking water industry as a whole. To look a little bit deeper into how reactivation works, what's happening in these kilns or furnaces where the reactivations are happening. So they sort of ramp up in temperature as the carbon moves through these furnaces. It'll start with a low temperature pre-treatment that drives off the water at about 100 degrees Celsius. So really just evaporation occurring initially. Then as the temperature increases, you get some physical processes and reactions, thermal devolatilization, and that's where that desorption starts to happen at around 100 to 250 degrees C. And then as the temperature continues to go up towards 750 degrees C, you get high temperature carbon condensation reactions. So that's sort of where these chemical reactions are starting to happen as we get to higher temperatures. And then as it approaches the 800 to 1000 degrees C, which is around the highest these levels get, there are even more chemical reactions and carbon gasification with water vapor, carbon dioxide, or oxygen. This is sort of where you see a lot of those reactions happening where the contaminants are coming off and then really being destroyed in that process, without really destroying the carbon through the process itself. So this is what's actually happening in a furnace itself as that temperature ramps up. So in light of the PFAS being labeled a forever chemical, we wanted to look at really multiple studies to verify that our reactivation process not only removes PFAS to below detectable levels on the carbon, but it also destroys PFAS to over 99.9% in our process. And this is really important, again, because that reactivated GAC can be reused. So this helps with market demand for GAC. It's also just a more environmentally sustainable solution. We're not moving the PFAS just somewhere else into the air. We're really breaking those bonds on the compounds themselves and destroying them. And how we actually verify this is sampling of various inputs and outputs through the process, and then calculating this, what we call the destruction and removal efficiency. And this is a pretty simple calculation. It's just the input, so input concentrations minus the output concentrations divided by the input times 100 gives you that destruction and removal efficiency as a percentage. So we have the spent carbon going into the reactivation furnace. We test both the spent carbon and the reactivated carbon to make sure that the PFAS is first coming off the carbon itself. And then we also test out of air out of the reactivation furnace into the abatement system, and then the stack emissions after the abatement system to ensure we're not putting PFAS into the air from those stack emissions. Now, in air, there is a specific method for PFAS compounds to be measured. There are different methods for different phases of testing. So if you're looking at a solid phase, liquid phase, gas phase, there are really different types of tests to detect PFAS, but the air is a little bit more novel of a one and comes with a kind of few others as well that I won't specifically get into today, but this is the main EPA method used for the stack emissions test. So this is really where the main destruction removal efficiency we want to look at is out of that final exhaust stack. So this is a vapor phase analysis for polar semi-volatile compounds that currently includes 49 targeted PFAS that are chain length 4 and longer. So PFOA and PFOS are definitely included in this, that are typically seen in drinking water compounds, but there are a lot of other PFAS compounds in this as well that are seen. So to look at this reactivation case study, so this is really where everything was sampled, and we used the best commercially available analytical method for PFAS. This was at an industrial reactivation facility. We have some tests at either, but in the sort of point of entry reactivation applications, they would likely be going to an industrial facility where then the industrial side will be utilizing that carbon after it's reactivated. So I'm going to show this study first, or this study in sort of this example. So again, we measure both the spent carbon and reactivated carbon through the furnace, as well as vapor phase analysis of the vapor coming out of the furnace. So to really ensure every point out of there, where or where aren't we detecting PFAS. And then there's a typical abatement process of a thermal treatment, a chemical scrubber that removes acid gases such as hydrofluoric acid, and then baghouse to remove particulate matter, and then the exhaust stack. And so we measure the analyses for PFAS out of each of those ends of the process. But the main one, the most important ones are out of the furnace and then out of that exhaust stack in the end. So looking at the actual results. So again, on the spent carbon, we have around 0.748 pounds per hour of total PFAS being extracted from the spent carbon. And then the reactivated carbon is below detectable limits on the reactivated media for any of the PFAS that were tested in that. So the PFAS is coming off of the reactivated carbon itself. And then out of just the furnace itself, before even the abatement system, we have levels of down to 8 to the -5 of total PFAS coming out of that furnace. So really almost all of the destruction of PFAS is happening in that furnace. This is extremely low levels coming out compared to what was on the spent carbon itself initially. So this is really nice that we're seeing a lot of that destruction just in the furnace itself, and then through the abatement process out of the exhaust stack. We're again down to the -5 levels, but even lower at around 4.8 of total PFAS, which ultimately leads to over 99.9% destruction of that total PFAS. And really, a lot of these are mostly non-detect results, but because there's certain detection limits, we can't specifically say that the PFAS is zero. But we have a lot of these are down to basically not detecting the PFAS with these current limits and where they are for these analyses. And these are at even lower levels coming out of this exhaust stack, or even similar or lower than what would come out of like an incinerator that's incinerating media with PFAS on it. So these are really good results to show that that PFAS is being destroyed and is not really being released into the air. We're actually getting rid of those bonds in general on the PFAS. So since we know this is really a useful technology and it's good to destroy the PFAS, how do you actually go about the reactivation procedure? So we sort of have just a good process of how you might go about this. The first step is a distributor will establish a service area based on Calgon carbon guidance. So, if they see, there's a few customers here that all have point of entry systems specifically with granular activated carbon that are being used for PFAS, we can kind of look at that, establish that area, and then provide a quote to the distributor for testing of those different sites, collect samples. The distributor can coordinate that sample collection so we can test the samples, and based on the results provided, approve or deny for reactivations. We have a carbon acceptance process that's essentially a pass or fail for whether the carbon can be safely reactivated. Most of the time, it will pass, and you won't have too many issues with not being able to reactivate. But that is a first part of the process, is getting that surface area established and then making sure, sending in samples so we can make sure that the carbon can be reactivated effectively and safely. And then if it's approved, the distributor will work with the dealers to pull media to a central location, and then they can ship the media to our reactivation site. We do have a minimum requirement of 30 cubic feet or around 1,000 pounds of carbon. So that's why you're pulling these media together, because a lot of these systems have lower amounts of carbon being used in that, a lot of times significantly lower. So if you're able to combine with some others to reactivate the carbon, that's sort of where this will be a great process, where the distributors especially can kind of set up these processes to make this a little bit more of a cost-effective option for some of these areas. And then once we receive the media, we'll reactivate the spent media, and then we can reuse it in industrial applications. And it can be useful in that side of things. I'm on the more municipal side, but we do have industrial applications for carbon as well that can use really any reactivated carbon. There's a little bit more restrictions on the sort of potable side, where you, in these cases, because it's a pulled carbon, may not be able to take it back yourself, at least at this time. So in this case, it's probably going to be reused in an industrial application, but it's still a much cheaper process, much more effective option than disposing the carbon with landfill or incineration. And so with that, I think that really touches on everything I was going to discuss today. I think we can go into the sort of Q&A portion. We have some questions from the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. That was awesome information about GAC types, GAC, PFAS treatment, and the reactivation process. So most of you have put questions in the chat already, but please, or in the Q&A box. So please put questions in the Q&A box. And while we are preparing for questions, I have a couple reminders. So a follow-up email will be sent with a link to the webinar recording. Additionally, if you are WQA certified, you will be earning 0.1 CPD by attending this live. And for an additional 0.15 CPD, you can complete a short quiz. So be on the lookout for an email from me when that quiz will be available. So we can begin our Q&A. So we have a question. Daniel, can you speak to the manufacturing process of activated carbon blocks used in many point of use applications, like how the particle size is homogenized, how particles are bonded, and how blocks are extruded?
So that's a good question. I mean, I know we do have a specific process in making sure that those are consistent. We certainly do, similar to what we might do with the granular media, is making sure that those are tested for specific parameters to make sure performance is going to be the same. Um, I can't speak to the exact manufacturing process of those blocks, but I know that we do have obviously quality control testing and everything to make sure those are being utilized correctly. And I definitely say reach out if you have to me, and I can kind of connect you with someone that can sort of talk about the specific process of that. But I know that is, yeah, a really good question, and um, kind of something that I have a little bit less experience in working with the blocks myself. So I'd say for sure reach out to myself or someone at Calgon, and we can kind of uh, answer that a little bit more uniformly.
Thank you. I can help connect you with that individual afterwards. Um, and they also asked, how do absorption kinetics differ between carbon blocks with small homogeneous particle sizes versus granulator active GAC columns with a range of grain sizes?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that kind of goes along with the first part of the question. Typically the blocks are designed for pretty similar kinetics that we want to see with what we might see with GAC columns. So typically pretty similar, but yeah, again, I think we could definitely help if you uh, kind of reach out and can discuss that a little bit more further and into specifics there.
Thanks, Daniel. Another question, is the same EBCT recommended for reagglomerated type activated carbon and standard activated carbon?
So short answer, yes, the direct activated um, will usually are designed around that 10 minutes of contact time. You just might not see as consistent of results. Really, a lot of times with carbon, the standard has become more of the reagglomerated type of activated carbon. It's become a lot more common in used in this space, especially for PFAS applications. So yeah, the empty bed contact time would be designed similarly. It would still be likely a similar mesh size of a 12 by 40 carbon in a similarly sized filter or vessel. There just might be some less consistency in quality or performance compared to the reagglomerated, but it would be the same contact time recommended.
Perfect. So you mentioned the re-agglomerated product can have tailored pore size. Can you share more details about how you can fulfill this and how precise you can control the pore size? And then a follow-up question with that, can this procedure tailor the pore size to less than 10 nanometers or even in the angstrom level?
Mhm. So, the pore size is a lot of times, I mean, it's somewhat tailored. It more has to do a lot of times with the starting material more than specifically tailoring it. And then the actual mesh size we're using it down to, so like a 12 by 40 mesh that would typically be used for PFAS. But it's more about the specific structure of the pores themselves. And again, we do have some of the fine mesh carbons that you might see some smaller pores in general, but it's less about controlling the pore size and more about really what happens naturally in the reactivation process with these different starting materials. That's more where the difference in the pore sizes and the pore structures come from.
Thank you. Another question, do you have any data on total organic fluorine removal through activated carbon?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if we see or if I know of any specific data we've seen with the total organic fluorine removal. Um, but I mean, we'd expect pretty, if you're talking about, you know, similar to what we might see on PFAS, that's a lot of times the main things that are looked at is the specific compounds that are detected rather than the just the total organic fluorine we're looking at. So I'm not sure if we have any specific data. We might have some that we sort of look at and talk about, but in general, a lot of these are just based on looking at specific compounds and how long those are removed until we get initial detection of one, and those typically make up a majority or all of the total organic fluorine, especially in a lot of these municipal water systems.
Thank you. We have another question. So do you have any data or information related to the removal of total organic carbon or dissolved organic carbon using activated carbon?
So yeah, we definitely have some studies and have a lot of information on TOC, DOC removal with activated carbon. A lot of times that can be a little bit more of a range of contact times and even mesh sizes of the carbons themselves. That's a little bit more flexible in removal. A lot of times with TOC and DOC removal, those are a lot of times dictated long term by biological activity. So you'll see relatively quick breakthrough in a lot of different carbon types. Um, but you'll eventually see that sort of flat line at a certain percentage of removal. Maybe you'll get pretty consistently 30% removal for a long period of time of TOC or DOC. And typically in these applications, that's mainly used to prevent those disinfection byproducts from forming. So that's usually a good level to remove the TOC to make sure that those aren't forming to levels above where they're regulated from. But we definitely have some specific tests that look at that, specific pilot tests, and even full-scale data will look a lot of times even better than a pilot test might, just because it has more of that long-term removal. You can see more effects from those organics. But there is lots of data on removing TOC with activated carbon. That was really a lot of times what we used this for before PFAS recently became an even bigger issue.
Thanks, Daniel. So in the reactivation study, have you looked at reactivation of spent point of use cartridges?
Mhm. Yeah, so it's a good question as well. To my knowledge, I don't think that's something we've really looked at. With the way the reactivation process works, I'm not sure if there really is any efficacy to having the cartridges being able to be reactivated and reused, just because of the manner of how they're kind of made and how they're used. The reactivation processes we have are really mainly specific to granular carbon itself. To my knowledge, that's not something we've really looked at. I'm not sure if that's something that would really be that possible to do, but it is certainly a good point and something to maybe examine and see if there is something there as an option.
Thank you. So we have another one. Do you think pore size/structure is more important aspect in PFAS removal comparing to the carbon surface chemistry?
They can both have impacts for sure. I think the pore structure is especially important where you can see a pretty big difference in removal between the different starting materials because of those different structures. Now there is some differences in that carbon surface chemistry that can optimize that removal further. But I think the pore structure first has to, make sure that that is most optimized first before looking at some of the surface chemistry, because that's really where you see some pretty big differences in removal.
Thank you. And then we have another one. Is reactivation of carbon an economical option for residential application where volume of carbon used is not that high?
Right. Yeah. So that's a great question as well, and that's sort of what I really wanted to hit on at the end of that reactivation section. The end of these slides is it can be a little bit more difficult, but if you're able to maybe talk to your distributors or dealers to see if they're able to know who else is maybe using carbon for these applications, for PFAS applications in a similar area, and try to pull that carbon together, then it is definitely a more economical option. And, we're hoping to find some more that can reach out and figure out ways to make sure we have that. Because again, we do have to have a certain minimum amount of 1,000 pounds of GAC to be able to reactivate it at our facilities. But if we can get that, then it is definitely a more sustainable solution. And so that's sort of part of the goal here, is to just try to get some people together to try to figure out where we might have some availability and options for that.
So, do mineral or non-organic solutes interfere with PFAS removal in the GAC applications?
Yeah. So that's a good question. Um, Typically, or really mainly, no, they won't interfere with the runtime of the carbon specifically. Where they might interfere is potentially building up or fouling the carbon. But usually those are be able to be resolved by backwashing a filter, and that's another reason with these point of entry systems, point of entry equipment, if they are able to be backwashable, that's another thing where you could see issues with solids or inorganics building up on a carbon system itself, where then you see pressure build up and it becomes more difficult to operate the system. Um, and if you're able to backwash, then you can backwash those particles out and be able to get the system back to where it was running with a clean bed. And so that's another, good reason to have those backwashable filters, because if you don't have that, then you may end up needing to exchange the carbon if that can't be backwashed out, depending on how much of a difference in sort of pressure you're getting or how much interference you're having with the carbon. But the inorganics themselves won't impact the performance of the carbon in removing the PFAS. It's more sort of other outside considerations with that.
Thank you. What is the relative cost difference of the four types of carbon, if there is a difference?
Mhm. So I can't speak to all of them specifically. I know we mainly deal with coal and coconut. Um, Typically, the things like wood and coconut carbons are uh, less or are overall cheaper than a bituminous coal would be. Um, but again, if you're looking for it for something like PFAS, the difference in performance much more makes up for any relative cost difference between the two. And then, recently things like tariffs in general could impact the cost of things like coconut, where a lot of times those are manufactured or found used outside of the US, where we have all domestic carbon here. So that's something that could impact the prices and has already started to impact some of the prices. I couldn't tell you the exact cost difference. We can give you a more specific answer if you reach out and ask our sales team, can give you sort of some general numbers on that. But typically, yeah, the coal is a little bit more expensive on a cost basis, but in terms of runtime, will run a lot longer and be cheaper overall in terms of, long-term use.
Awesome, thank you. So when you mentioned the hydraulic loading rate, what's the proper velocity range for water to enter the system?
So yeah, for carbon, usually we want to design around 2 to 10 gallons per minute per square foot. That's the optimal range we see. Below that we can have some issues with flow channeling. And too high, you can end up with a little bit too high of head loss through the bed, higher pressure to pump through. In either case, might not get as good of performance as keeping it in that range. So that's for any contaminant, but PFAS included. Carbon, we usually want to run between 2 to 10 GPM per square foot.
Thank you. And then we have one more. Is there any easy test to check for the remaining PFAS removal capacity of a carbon bed?
Mhm. So the best option is really monitoring just the effluent of the filter itself. I know that can be difficult because the detection limits are a lot of times so close to where you might need to exchange a carbon filter. That's why we a lot of times recommend having some of these filters in a lead lag setup where you run through one bed of carbon and then through another with the same water, so you can detect the PFAS at the bottom of one, and then you have another bed of carbon to sort of catch anything coming off while you have to exchange that first vessel, and then you can sort of switch that direction if you're able. Um, we do have some options where you could send in a sample and we can look at some parameters like the density and iodine of the carbon and see how those have changed. But in these smaller a lot of times point of entry systems and things, a lot of times the best is just try to closely monitor the system, and if you're able to have a lead lag system, so you don't have an issue of PFAS coming out and into the water you're actually going to be drinking or using.
Thank you. Actually, we have one more question before we go. Do you think that GAC filters could be downsized to cartridge size filters? For example, the same GAC media used in point of entry, but in a filter that's the size of a cartridge filter that you would use in point of use.
So not really for what I would think. Really, those smaller cartridge filters or sides that are used in point of use applications are a lot of times that size because they're such lower contact times. We need either those cartridge types of filters, finer mesh carbons, to make sure that we have good removal with such short contact times. And that's really the main difference there is we can have that larger mesh in the point of entry systems and make sure we're getting those 10 minutes of contact time, because in those smaller filters, it could be difficult to first push water through carbon of that size at that low amount at those lows of flows that are typically seen in them, going through those types of filters. So it would just be a lot more difficult to operate as well. So that's why there are kind of those major differences is the contact times and mesh sizes are more like optimized for each sort of setup.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you everyone for all the great questions today. If anyone has additional questions, you can email us at foundation@wqrf.org, or in the chat, there is a Calgon Carbon specific email and website for contacting them specifically for more in-depth questions. So thank you for joining us for our final summer school session for the summer. We would love for you to stay connected with WQRF. You can scan the QR codes to explore more of WQRF's work and ways you can contribute to our mission. Thanks for joining.